Scientists and dock staff are spending the next 3 weeks trying to find out if the world's biggest mouse hunt has been a success.
In 2016, New Zealand took a bold leap, investing $680,000 to wipe out every mouse on the remote Antipodes Islands, a place once overrun by these tiny invaders.
It's the latest challenge pushing farmers to breaking point. Millions of mice running riot and destroying valuable stock feed.
Armed with helicopters, bait, and unshakable resolve, scientists faced brutal winds and endless challenges. How did a place once on the brink manage such an unbelievable comeback?
Just in our farm, we've seen, at an estimate, about 2 million mice. In my estimate is what I've seen on my place.
2 million mice?
Yeah.
The answer lies in a bold mission where all the mice on the island were wiped out. A year later, what they discovered left everyone shocked.
There's a mice plague wiping farmers out, and these mongrel things are everywhere. People are at mental breaking point. Believe me, I've been speaking all day to farmers about this.
The Lost Island. Far out in the Southern Ocean lies a tiny cluster of islands called the Antipodes. They sit about 860 kilometers southeast of New Zealand's South Island, so remote that only scientists and conservation teams ever set foot there. The place feels untouched by time. It's covered in thick tussock grass, jagged cliffs, and deep bogs that can swallow your boots whole. The weather changes in minutes, with sudden gusts of rain and fog rolling in from nowhere. Despite the harsh conditions, the Antipodes are alive with wildlife found nowhere else on Earth. Tiny green parakeets dart through the grass, and seabirds like the Antipodes snipe and pipit nest quietly among the rocks. The air is filled with the constant call of penguins returning from the sea. That mix of isolation and biodiversity earned the islands a UNESCO World Heritage status, placing them among the most protected spots on the planet. But the same remoteness that keeps them wild also makes them vulnerable. Supplies have to be shipped from mainland New Zealand, and the rough seas mean months can pass before another boat arrives. When humans first reached these islands centuries ago, they brought something far more dangerous than themselves: stowaway mice that would later threaten everything living there. The Antipodes might look calm and beautiful from above, but beneath that surface, the ecosystem was barely holding on. Scientists later described it as one of the most delicate environments in the southern hemisphere, where even a tiny disturbance could throw everything off balance. What happened next, how people almost ruined it and then worked tirelessly to restore it, would go on to become one of the most remarkable conservation stories in New Zealand's history. The unseen invaders. Sometime in the 19th century, when sealing and whaling ships still roamed the southern seas, a few small stowaways made their way onto the Antipodes Islands. No one paid attention to them then, just ordinary house mice hiding in the cargo. But what came next quietly rewrote the island's future. With no predators to keep them in check, the mice spread fast. Within years, they were everywhere, from the rocky cliffs to the soft grasslands where seabirds built their nests. At night, the islands that once echoed with bird calls turned restless. The mice began feeding on anything they could find: seeds, insects, and eventually, bird eggs. For ground-nesting birds like the Antipodes parakeet, pipit, and snipe, the danger was constant. The mice would gnaw through nests, eating eggs and even attacking chicks alive. These weren't ordinary house pests anymore. They had become tiny predators, reshaping the island's fragile balance. By the time scientists returned generations later, the damage was undeniable. They found fewer seabirds each season, and some species had vanished completely from areas they once thrived in. Burrow-dwelling birds stopped nesting on parts of the island altogether. The lush, noisy colony that explorers once described had turned eerily quiet. Field researchers studying the ecosystem began documenting the growing crisis. Every year, the mice population surged during the warmer months, overwhelming the island's natural food supply. They chewed through plants, disrupted soil systems, and left behind an almost sterile landscape. For an island that was supposed to be a sanctuary for rare wildlife, the Antipodes had become a battleground for survival. What began with just a few stowaway mice had grown into one of the most serious ecological crises in New Zealand's sub-Antarctic region: the silent ecological collapse. By the early 2000s, something troubling was happening on the Antipodes Islands. Researchers who endured the harsh seas and freezing winds came back with worrying news. The bird colonies that once filled the island with life were disappearing faster than anyone expected. Areas that used to echo with the sounds of storm petrels, pipits, and parakeets had gone strangely quiet. What shocked scientists most wasn't just that the birds were dying, but the disturbing way it was happening. Cameras set up by field researchers captured disturbing scenes. tiny house mice gnawing on live seabird chicks, sometimes in groups, under the cover of darkness. This behavior had never been seen before in the region. These mice, descendants of stowaways from old sealing and whaling ships, had adapted in ways no one thought possible. With no natural predators to keep their population in check, they grew bolder, larger, and more aggressive. They turned from scavengers into hunters. The impact rippled through the ecosystem. As bird populations declined, nutrient cycles that relied on seabird droppings to fertilize the soil began to break down. Vegetation growth changed, affecting insects and other small life that depended on it. The island's delicate balance was unraveling piece by piece. Scientists documented that several species, such as the Antipodes snipe and parakeet, were retreating to smaller pockets of land, barely surviving. Even hardy seabirds like the storm petrel and prion, which had survived centuries of harsh weather, were on the brink of vanishing from the island. The situation became so severe that conservationists began calling the Antipodes a silent ecological collapse. By the mid-2000s, the evidence was clear. Without action, the islands were on track to lose not just a few species, but their entire natural balance. The spark that changed everything. In 2012, a bold idea began to take shape in New Zealand. After years of heartbreaking research showing how mice were destroying the Antipodes Islands, the Department of Conservation decided it was time to fight back. They called it the $1 Million Mouse Project, a name that quickly caught public attention. The goal was ambitious and simple on paper. Wipe out every single mouse from the island, but anyone who knew the scale of such missions understood just how hard that would be. This wasn't the first time New Zealand had attempted rodent eradication. The country had already led successful operations on smaller islands like Campbell and Raoul. But the Antipodes were in a league of their own. They were remote, windy, and covered in steep volcanic terrain. Getting there required days of sailing through unpredictable Southern Ocean waters. Once there, teams would have to deal with freezing rain, limited shelter, and zero room for mistakes. The project was spearheaded by the Antipodes Island Restoration Trust, with major support from WWF New Zealand and the general public. Donations poured in from people who wanted to help protect the country's wildlife. In total, more than $1 million New Zealand dollars were raised through crowdfunding, making it one of the largest community-backed conservation efforts in the country's history. Experts debated whether it could even work. Mice are tiny, adaptable, and capable of surviving in the smallest cracks or food sources left behind. A single surviving female could restart the entire population. Still, the Department of Conservation believed it was worth the risk. They planned to use helicopters to spread specially designed poison bait across the island, timed for winter when food sources were scarce. It was a daring plan fueled by equal parts science and hope. For the first time in decades, there was a real chance to give the Antipodes Islands, and their struggling wildlife, a fighting shot at recovery. The world's toughest island challenge. When the team first started planning the operation, they knew they weren't dealing with just another island. The Antipodes are brutal. Picture more than 2,000 hectares of jagged cliffs, slippery bogs, and cold winds that never seem to stop. Rain comes sideways, and fog can roll in so thick you can barely see a few steps ahead. Even experienced conservation workers who had handled remote projects before admitted this was unlike anything they'd faced. Because of its sub-antarctic location, the island experiences harsh weather conditions for much of the year. Supply drops were nearly impossible, and the waves around it are some of the roughest on the planet. Helicopters could only land during rare windows of calm weather, and ships had to anchor far offshore to avoid getting wrecked by sudden storms. Every piece of equipment, from bait containers to fuel drums, had to be carefully timed and tightly secured. One mistake could cost the mission. The challenge didn't end with logistics. The terrain itself was a constant test of endurance. Teams had to trek through thick tussock grass and boggy ground, carrying heavy gear while being pelted by icy rain. Communication was limited, and there was no room for outside rescue if things went wrong. Experienced pest control experts described it as one of the hardest missions ever attempted. Compared to the Antipodes, places like Campbell Island or Macquarie seemed almost easy. That was exactly what made this project so important. If they could succeed here, on one of the toughest islands on the planet, it would show that no ecosystem was too far gone to recover. The odds were tough, but for the team behind the $1 Million Mouse Project, quitting was never an option. Planning the impossible. Before a single foot ever touched the island, scientists and planners spent years figuring out how to make the operation work. They weren't just guessing. Every detail had to be precise because a small mistake could mean the mice would survive and the entire mission would fail. The team started by studying the island's geography through satellite images and computer simulations. They needed to understand how the rugged cliffs, valleys, and bogs would affect bait distribution. Wind turned out to be one of their biggest challenges. The Antipodes are known for wild, unpredictable gusts that can change direction in seconds. A strong wind could easily blow the poison bait into the sea, or leave whole areas untouched. To prevent that, the team ran endless wind simulations, trying to predict the safest and most effective way to spread the bait. Timing was also critical. They had to act when food for the mice was scarce, but before breeding season started, ensuring no new litters could survive after the operation. The Department of Conservation teamed up with Wildlife Management International, blending local knowledge with international expertise. Together, they built a GPS-guided bait drop system that allowed helicopters to cover every patch of land precisely. Every flight route was carefully mapped out, and pilots followed digital grids to make sure the bait was spread evenly. They even studied bird habits closely. Some seabirds could mistake the bait for food, so the team adjusted both timing and formula to keep native species safe. Months of testing went into seeing how the bait would hold up under freezing rain, constant moisture, and strong winds. By the time everything was ready, the mission looked more like a high-tech rescue operation than a simple pest control job. The $680,000 gamble. When the final numbers came in, everyone knew this wasn't going to be a small operation. The $1 million mouse project ended up costing about 680,000 New Zealand dollars, a figure that made even veteran conservationists pause. The money came from a mix of sources: the Department of Conservation, WWF New Zealand, Island Conservation, and thousands of ordinary people who donated through public campaigns. It was one of those rare moments where the public and science came together for a single cause. Every dollar had to count. Getting equipment and supplies to the Antipodes was an expensive challenge in itself. The island sits deep in the sub-antarctic zone, days away by ship, and everything from bait pellets to fuel had to be transported across rough seas. Once there, nothing could be wasted. The helicopters, which were the heart of the operation, burned through thousands of dollars worth of fuel every flight. Insurance, safety gear, and maintenance added even more to the total. The bait wasn't ordinary either. It had been specially formulated to survive the wet, freezing conditions and to appeal specifically to mice while minimizing risk to native birds. Each pellet's weight and distribution pattern were calculated to ensure that every corner of the 2,000-hectare island was covered. To keep the math tight, teams double-checked everything: the wind speed, load weight, and even the timing between drops. They had no room for mistakes. Every flight, every drop of bait had to count. The operation begins. When winter arrived in 2016, the real test began. The Royal New Zealand Navy ship HMNZS Wellington carried 2 helicopters and all the gear needed for the remote Antipodes Islands. It was a risky trip across some of the roughest seas in the Southern Ocean, but there was no other way to get the equipment there. Once the ship anchored offshore, crews began unloading everything: fuel drums, bait pallets, and survival supplies, to set up base on the island. From June through August, the helicopters flew back and forth over the 2,000-hectare island, scattering bait with incredible precision. Each run was guided by GPS to make sure not a single patch of land was missed. The goal was to reach every mouse, even in the cliffs and soggy valleys. The pilots had to navigate low visibility, icy winds that sometimes reached more than 80 kilometers per hour, and a constant risk of mechanical failure in the freezing air. On the ground, the support crew battled the same harsh conditions. They lived in temporary shelters, surrounded by thick fog, rain, and biting cold. Every day was a balance between progress and survival. Supplies were limited, and the weather changed without warning. The helicopters could only fly when the skies allowed, which meant long stretches of waiting followed by frantic bursts of activity. Each successful flight meant another piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Despite the pressure, the team's coordination was almost flawless. By the end of the season, they had covered every corner of the island, something many had doubted could even be done. For the first time in over a century, there was hope that the Antipodes might finally be free of its smallest but deadliest invader. Life on the edge. Life on the Antipodes during the eradication mission was not for the faint-hearted. The field teams lived for weeks in a place that barely seemed made for people. Their camp sat on soggy ground, surrounded by cliffs, bogs, and curious penguins that wandered close to inspect the newcomers. The wind never seemed to stop, and the air carried a chill that soaked into everything. Even simple daily tasks felt like small battles against nature. There were no roads or vehicles to make things easier. Every bag of food, every fuel drum, and every piece of gear had to be dragged by hand through knee-deep mud. The terrain was slippery and uneven, and one wrong step could mean a twisted ankle, or worse. Moving supplies from the landing site to the camp often took hours, and when rain poured, it turned the entire area into a swamp. The isolation made things even more intense. The Antipodes Islands are hundreds of kilometers from the nearest inhabited land, which meant that if anyone got seriously injured, help would take days to arrive. The team had strict safety routines and constant radio check-ins, but everyone knew that if something went wrong, they were mostly on their own. Despite the tough conditions, morale stayed surprisingly strong. The shared goal kept everyone focused. They cooked simple meals together, repaired equipment in makeshift shelters, and learned to laugh at the never-ending mud. The penguins and sea lions provided daily company, sometimes blocking paths or stealing bits of gear out of curiosity. Every person there understood the importance of what they were doing. The work was exhausting and uncomfortable, but it carried a sense of purpose that made every cold, wet morning worth it. Nature's test of patience. Once the helicopters lifted off and the last bait drop was done, the Antipodes Islands were left in complete silence. Months of backbreaking work ended with one simple question that no one could yet answer. Did it actually work? The scientists and field teams packed up and left the island to nature, knowing that from this point onward, patience would be their biggest test. The rules were clear. No one could disturb the island for months. This was to allow any remaining mice to reveal themselves. If even one pregnant mouse had survived, it could repopulate the entire island in a matter of months, undoing everything. For the Department of Conservation, this was the most stressful part of the entire mission. They could only wait and hope that the baiting had reached every hidden burrow, every nook of the volcanic cliffs, and every patch of moss where the mice might have taken shelter. Back in New Zealand, the team monitored the weather and prepared for the eventual return trip. The sub-antarctic winter was brutal, and the island would remain off-limits until the following summer. During that time, scientists studied similar eradication projects, comparing outcomes and refining their detection methods. They planned how to inspect the Antipodes for any signs of survival, tiny droppings, gnawed seeds, or footprints in the damp soil. The waiting period stretched on for months, filled with uncertainty. Every person involved knew that failure was still possible. Previous mouse eradication attempts on other islands had failed because a few rodents had managed to hide, or because bait had washed away before being eaten. So, while the island stood quiet under stormy skies, the future of the project hung in suspense. Nature would give the final verdict. Either the team had achieved the impossible, or all their work and hundreds of thousands of dollars had gone to waste. 1 year after the return, when the Department of Conservation team finally returned to the Antipodes Islands in 2017, it felt like stepping onto another planet. The wind was still howling, the cliffs still unforgiving, but this time, there was something different in the air. The island, once alive with the rustling of mice in the undergrowth, now seemed eerily quiet. For the first time in almost 2 centuries, the invasive squeaks and scurrying were gone. Still, the scientists didn't want to celebrate too early. They had come to find out the truth. Armed with motion sensor cameras, tracking tunnels and traps, the team spread out across the island. Every corner, every clump of grass, and every seabird nesting site was checked with precision. For months, they searched, setting up monitoring devices designed to detect even the slightest sign of life: a footprint, a strand of fur, a gnawed seed, or a single dropping. The silence was almost unnerving, but as days turned into weeks, a quiet sense of hope began to build. As the data came in, it told the story they had all been waiting for. No footprints in the inked tracking tunnels, no droppings near burrows, no images of tiny bodies darting through the night. The scientists double-checked their sensors and recalibrated their cameras, almost not believing the results. But the outcome stayed the same: nothing. The island was completely free of mice. It was one of those rare moments in conservation history when everything had gone exactly as planned. The $680,000 gamble, the sleepless nights, the storms, and the endless planning had paid off. After more than 200 years of damage, the Antipodes were finally rid of their unwanted invaders. For the first time in generations, the seabirds could nest in peace. It was quiet, yes, but this time, that silence wasn't a warning sign. It was the sound of recovery beginning. Nature fights back. When the scientists confirmed that the Antipodes Islands were finally mouse-free, they expected recovery to take years. But nature had other plans. Within just a few months, the island began showing signs of life that no one had seen in decades. The haunting quiet that had once settled over the cliffs was replaced by the sound of wings and songs. Bird calls began to echo across valleys that had long been silent, as if the island itself was exhaling after centuries of pressure. The Antipodes parakeets, which had been forced to nest in cliffs and rocky crevices to avoid the mice, started returning to the ground. They were seen digging new burrows, flitting through tussock grass, and chirping in pairs, something not witnessed in generations. The tiny Antipodes pipits, once nearly gone, began rebuilding their numbers too, confidently hopping around open clearings that had been dangerous before. These birds weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. Even the plants responded. For years, the mice had devoured seeds before they could ever sprout, stalling natural regeneration. Now small green shoots began covering the slopes. The native megaherbs, lush, brightly colored plants that had been struggling to grow, started returning, carpeting the ground with life. Botanists later found that seed germination rates had skyrocketed, showing how quickly ecosystems can bounce back once their balance is restored. Insect populations, too, began to rebound. Species that had nearly disappeared were seen again in monitoring surveys, helping pollinate the very flowers they once depended on. Every sign pointed to the same truth. Without the constant predation of mice, the Antipodes were healing faster than anyone imagined. It was as though the island had been holding its breath for more than 100 years, waiting for the moment it could start over. Once the silence had meant loss, now it meant renewal. The $1 Million Mouse Project had not only erased a threat, it had given nature the space to fight back and win. Global recognition and lessons learned. The success on the Antipodes Islands didn't go unnoticed. It caught the world's attention. What started as a daring mission on a small, wind-battered island quickly turned into a global example of how damaged ecosystems can come back to life. Conservationists and scientists everywhere were inspired. The project showed that if a remote and harsh place like the Antipodes could recover, then almost any island could be restored. Still, it wasn't as simple as dropping bait and leaving. The mission pushed teams to plan carefully, adapt fast, and stay tough through some of the most brutal weather on the planet. The lessons learned didn't stop in New Zealand. They spread across oceans. In Chile, researchers working to revive the Juan Fernandez Islands closely studied the Antipodes project, learning how to stay precise and safe in unpredictable conditions. On South Georgia, far out in the South Atlantic, conservationists used the same baiting techniques to eliminate millions of rats and bring native birds back from near extinction. Even on Tristan da Cunha, one of the most isolated island communities in the world, teams applied what they learned from the Antipodes to protect their seabird colonies from invasive mice. For scientists, the biggest revelation was that nature can heal faster than anyone expects, if it's simply given the chance. When people stop the damage and give life room to recover, nature always finds a way to bounce back. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.